The starter hit once. CLUNK. The auctioneer slapped the faded tractor's hood. Seized engine. Parts tractor. Then, 73-year-old Earl Mercer raised his hand. 1200. The crowd turned. The tractor had been sitting for years. It would not crank. A local mechanic had already tried the starter and could not make the engine turn. But Earl had noticed something nobody else had followed far enough. Fresh wrench marks on the starter bolts. A bright scar where metal had been rubbing, and when the starter hit, the fan moved. Barely. Earl looked at the auctioneer. "I'm not saying the tractor's good." He glanced back at the engine. "I'm saying you haven't proved it's seized." If Earl was wrong, $1,200 had just bought him several thousand pounds of rust. A bad crankshaft. A damaged block. A ruined transmission. Any one of them could end the gamble. But Earl remembered that same brutal clunk from a tractor his father had repaired 46 years earlier. Back then, the engine had not been seized either. The problem had been somewhere else. So before Earl paid for Lot 86, he asked for one simple test. Not a rebuild. Not another guess. One test nobody at the auction had completed, and when they rocked the tractor backward, something inside released with a sharp metallic click. That was when Earl knew the crowd had stopped asking questions too soon. 3 weeks later, the same tractor would be pulling a planter through Earl's north field. But first, he had to find out what that click had actually meant. By 10 o'clock that Saturday morning, nearly everything worth buying had already been sold. The Miller Farm auction had started before sunrise, with pickups lining both sides of the county road and men in work boots carrying paper cups of coffee through rows of machinery. There were hay wagons, rusted cultivators, a grain drill with one bent opener, 2 stock trailers, and enough hand tools to fill 3 barns. Most of it had a story. Almost none of it had a future. The Miller family had farmed that ground for more than 60 years. But the last cattle had been sold the previous fall. Now the land was going to a developer, the house to a young couple from town, and everything that could be lifted, dragged, hauled, or driven was being turned into numbered lots. Lot 86 sat at the far end of the machinery row. An old diesel tractor. Its red paint had faded almost to brown across the hood. The seat was split open. One rear tire was soft enough to sag at the bottom, and dried mud had hardened around the drawbar like concrete. Someone had written 3 words across the auction sheet. Engine locked up. Earl Mercer read them twice. He was 73. Lean as a fence post, with a canvas coat polished dark at the elbows, and hands that looked permanently stained by grease and soil. He had spent most of the morning saying almost nothing. He had watched people overpay for shiny equipment and ignore ugly equipment that still had useful years left in it. But Lot 86 made him stop. A younger man stepped onto the tractor's platform and turned the key. The dash lights came alive. He pushed the starter. CLUNK. Nothing. He tried again. CLUNK. The sound was hard and immediate, more like a hammer striking steel than an engine trying to turn. The auctioneer grinned toward the crowd. "There you have it. Gentlemen, she's not hiding anything." A few men laughed. One called out, "Sell it by the pound." Another said, "You'd spend more hauling it home than it's worth." The auctioneer checked his sheet. Owner says it was parked after it quit turning over. Local fellow looked at it. Best guess is seized engine, so we're selling it exactly as it sits. Earl didn't look at the auctioneer. He crouched near the right side of the engine. There were oil stains everywhere, but most were old and dusty. Then he saw something cleaner. 2 bright marks on the starter mounting bolts, fresh enough that the oxidation had not returned. Someone had removed that starter recently. Earl leaned closer. There was another mark near the housing, a narrow polished crescent where metal had rubbed metal. Behind him, a machinery dealer named Carl Brenner folded his arms. "Don't tell me you're thinking about it." Earl stood slowly. "What'd they say was wrong with it?" Carl shrugged. "Engine won't turn. That's usually all you need to know." "Usually?" Carl laughed. "That thing's been sitting half a decade. Could have water in a cylinder. Could have rusted rings. Could have wiped a bearing. You planning to rebuild it in your kitchen?" Earl looked back at the tractor. "No." The auctioneer climbed onto a hay wagon that served as his platform. All right. Lot 86. Parts tractor. Who'll give me 1,000? Silence. 800? Nothing. 500? A scrapyard buyer near the front raised 2 fingers. The auctioneer pointed. 500? Now 6? Earl still hadn't raised his hand. He was watching the fan, watching the starter, listening again in his memory to that single violent clunk. Then, almost to himself, he said, "That engine isn't stuck." Carl turned toward him. "What?" But Earl was already walking toward the auction ring. Earl Mercer had not planned to buy a tractor that morning. At least, that was what he told himself when he left home before daylight. He had come for cultivator shanks, maybe a used hydraulic cylinder, and whatever old tools stayed cheap. Because Earl already owned a tractor, the problem was that it sat behind his barn beneath a blue tarp with its transmission opened. 3 days earlier, while pulling a disc across the north field, it had jumped out of gear hard enough for Earl to feel the shock through his boots. He stopped immediately. That probably saved the rear end from destroying itself. It did not make the repair cheap. Even used parts would take time to find, and time was the one thing Earl did not have. The first field needed planting soon. Spring ground had finally begun drying. And Earl knew what happened when a farmer missed a short weather window. 2 good days disappeared. Then rain came. Then 2 days became 10. His son Daniel had offered the practical answer. Here Benson to plant it. Earl had looked toward the field. And if Benson gets rain before he reaches us? Daniel shrugged. Then we wait. That's what I'm trying not to do. Custom operators worked on their own schedules. Larger farms came first. Earl's 40 acres would come when somebody else had time. Daniel had another suggestion. Then maybe stop farming all of it. Earl did not answer. He lived alone now. Mary had been gone 6 years. Daniel had his own job, his own mortgage, his own children. Nobody depended on Earl's fields the way they once had, but that was not the same as the fields no longer mattering. Earl knew where the north ground stayed wet after rain, where clay tightened in August, where corn always seemed to grow taller along one shallow rise. His father had worked that ground before him. Earl was not ready to let a broken transmission decide when he was finished. He had looked at used tractors. Anything dependable enough to work immediately seemed to cost more than he wanted to spend. Anything cheap enough to interest him usually carried somebody else's problem beneath fresh paint. Then he saw Lot 86. No fresh paint, no sales pitch, no attempt to make it look better than it was. Just an old tractor with a bad reputation and a tag that read, "Engine locked up." Most buyers saw that as a warning. Earl saw a question. Back at the auction ring, the scrapyard buyer held the bid at $500. The auctioneer scanned the crowd. 600? Anybody give me 6? Earl looked toward the starter. Fresh wrench marks, a polished scar beside the housing, a fan that had moved just enough to bother him. None of it proved the tractor was good, but none of it proved the engine was seized either. Earl thought about the broken tractor beneath the tarp, the seed waiting in the shed, the north field drying by the hour. Then he raised his hand. The auctioneer caught Earl's bid immediately. 600 in the back. Now 7? The scrapyard buyer lifted his card without looking at Earl. 700. A few heads turned, not because $700 was a large amount, because nobody expected the old farmer in the canvas coat to compete for a tractor everyone had already written off. Earl kept his eyes on Lot 86. The tractor looked even worse now that the morning sun had reached it. The hood was faded. The muffler leaned slightly to one side. A streak of rust ran down beneath the exhaust manifold. To most people, every flaw seemed to confirm the same conclusion. Dead? The auctioneer raised his voice. 700. Looking for 8. Before Earl could move, Carl Brenner stepped closer. Don't. Earl glanced at him. Carl lowered his voice. I'm telling you as a friend, if that crankshaft is locked, you're not buying a tractor. You're buying a rebuild. Earl looked back toward the machine. Did you check it? No. Then how do you know? Carl gave him a tired smile. Because I've seen enough of them. That answer bothered Earl more than Carl intended. Enough of them. Earl had heard men say that about cattle. Weather. Land. Machinery. And people. Usually right before they stopped looking. The auctioneer called again. 800? Earl raised his hand. 8 in the back. The scrapyard buyer hesitated this time, then raised his card. 900. The crowd murmured. Carl shook his head. You're paying above scrap now. Earl did not answer. Instead, he walked closer to the tractor, while the auctioneer paused to joke with the crowd. A local mechanic named Wade Foster was standing beside the front tire. Wade had worked on farm equipment around the county for years. The auctioneer pointed toward him. Wade, tell him what you told me. Wade looked uncomfortable. I said the engine wouldn't turn when I was here Tuesday. Locked? I said it might be. The auctioneer laughed. Might be locked. Probably locked. Either way, she doesn't run. Several men chuckled. Earl crouched again near the starter. Did you pull this? Wade looked down. The starter? Yes. I loosened it. Didn't take it all the way out. Why? Wanted to see if it was bound up? Earl touched one of the mounting bolts. The clean mark was exactly where Wade's wrench had broken through years of dirt. What happened? Nothing. Nothing? Wade shrugged. Starter still wouldn't turn the engine. That was not the answer Earl was listening for. Did you try turning the engine after you loosened it? Wade paused. No. Carl exhaled sharply behind them. Earl. Kumeon. But Earl's attention had shifted. He reached through the side opening and put 2 fingers against the fan belt. Then he pressed. The belt was not loose. That meant when the fan had moved a fraction during the starter test, something farther down the system had moved with it. Not much, but not nothing. Earl looked at the front crank pulley. There was a faint chalk mark across its edge, probably left by Wade during Tuesday's inspection. It no longer lined up exactly where Earl expected. A tiny difference, easy to dismiss. That was what interested him. If the engine were truly seized, solid, Earl thought, why had anything moved at all? The auctioneer slapped the tractor's fender. Come on, Earl. You're a smart man. Don't fall in love with rusty iron. The crowd laughed again. Earl stood. I'm not in love with it. Then why are you bidding? Earl looked toward the starter housing. Because the sound was wrong. Because the fan had moved. Because somebody had loosened the starter but never separated it from the engine. Because everyone was treating a symptom like a verdict. But Earl said none of that. He only asked one question. Mind if we rock it? The auctioneer blinked. Rock what? The tractor. Wade looked at Earl now with real interest. Carl frowned. What exactly are you trying to prove? Earl stepped toward the rear tire. I don't know yet. That was the first completely honest thing anyone had said about Lot 86 all morning. The sound took Earl back 46 years. Not to a dealership, not to a repair manual. To a winter morning in his father's machine shed. Earl had been 27 then. Impatient. Broke. And convinced that every mechanical problem could be solved by working faster. Their main tractor had refused to start before feeding time. He remembered the cold more than anything else. The kind that made steel burn your fingers through gloves. His father, Walter Mercer, had climbed onto the tractor, pulled the choke, and hit the starter. CLUNK. Nothing. He tried again. CLUNK. Earl had already made up his mind. Engines locked. Walter looked at him. You checked? It won't turn. That's not what I asked. Earl remembered feeling irritated. There were cattle waiting, frozen water troughs, a wagon that needed moving. They did not have time for philosophy. He grabbed a wrench. I'll pull the plugs. Walter stopped him. Start with the thing making the noise. That sentence had stayed with Earl longer than almost anything his father ever taught him. They removed the starter. It came free with more resistance than it should have. The small drive gear at the end was still pushed forward. Walter held it up in the weak morning light. See that? The teeth were polished bright on one side. The starter drive had jammed against the flywheel instead of returning. The engine had not seized. The starting system had locked itself against the engine and made a healthy machine appear dead. Walter put a bar on the crank pulley. The engine moved. Slowly. Smoothly. Earl remembered the embarrassment almost as clearly as the relief. He had been ready to tear half the tractor apart because he had mistaken one symptom for the entire problem. Walter did not laugh at him. That made the lesson worse. He simply said, a machine can only tell you what it's doing. It can't tell you why. They cleaned the starter drive, dressed the damaged teeth, and reinstalled it. The tractor started before noon. Earl had forgotten plenty of repairs since then. He had forgotten part numbers, torque specifications, the exact model of the tractor, but he had never forgotten that sound. CLUNK. Hard. Immediate. No real attempt by the engine to roll through a compression stroke. Back at the Miller auction, Carl Brenner was still talking. "You hear me?" "Earl?" Earl blinked. The old shed was gone. The frozen morning was gone. His father had been dead nearly 30 years. But Lot 86 sat in front of him making the same accusation against itself. Engine locked. Maybe it was. Earl knew better than to trust memory more than evidence. A similar sound did not guarantee a similar failure. This tractor could still have a rusted cylinder, a damaged bearing, a broken internal part. That was why he had asked to rock it. Not because he knew the answer, because he knew the question. The auctioneer stepped down from the wagon. "All right. You want to rock it? Rock it. But if you break something, you bought it." A few men laughed. Earl walked toward the rear wheel. Wade Foster followed him. "What do you want me to do?" "Put it in high gear." Wade climbed onto the platform. Carl stayed where he was. "This is a waste of time." Earl placed both hands against the rear tire. "Maybe." Wade shifted the lever. Earl leaned his weight forward. The tractor did not move. Not an inch. Someone behind them said, "Told you." Earl reset his feet. Then he looked at Wade. "Now we go the other way." Earl moved to the left rear tire. Wade stayed in the seat with the transmission in high gear. "Ready?" Earl asked. Wade nodded. The first push did nothing. The tractor stood exactly where it had been. Heavy and stubborn. Its rear tire sunk slightly into the dry earth. Carl folded his arms. "There's your answer." Earl ignored him. He shifted his hands higher on the tire. Again. This time, Wade climbed down and joined him. Together, they pushed forward. The tractor rocked barely enough to compress the tire, then stopped. A man near the auction wagon laughed. Engines locked tighter than a bank vault. The auctioneer grinned. "You satisfied, Earl?" Earl looked at the front of the tractor. The fan had moved. Only a fraction. But he had seen it. He walked around the hood and studied the crank pulley again. The chalk mark Wade had made earlier had changed position. Not much. Maybe the width of a fingernail. But enough. Earl pointed. "You see that?" Wade leaned closer. "The mark? It moved." Wade stared at it. Carl stepped over. "So what?" Earl straightened. "If the crank is locked solid, it shouldn't move at all." Carl shook his head. "Could be backlash. Could be the belt slipping. Could be anything." "Could be." Earl did not argue. That was the difference between suspicion and proof. He walked back to the rear wheel. "Now backward." Wade frowned. "We just tried it." "Forward." "Saw? Now backward." They pushed from the opposite side. At first, nothing happened. Then Earl felt the tire move against his palms. An inch. Maybe less. He stopped. Again. This time the tractor rolled backward just enough for the drivetrain to load in the opposite direction. A sharp, metallic sound came from the engine bay. Click. Every man standing close enough heard it. Earl froze. Carl's expression changed. Wade looked toward the starter. What was that? Earl did not answer. He went straight to the right side of the engine and crouched beside the starter housing. The polished crescent he had noticed earlier seemed different now. The starter assembly sat with less tension against the flywheel housing. Earl reached in and touched the casing. Then he looked up at Wade. "Try the fan." Wade put both hands on one blade and pulled gently. The fan moved. Not freely, but farther than before. A quarter turn. Then resistance. Wade's eyes narrowed. "That's compression." Earl nodded once. Carl stepped closer. "Do it again." Wade pulled the fan backward. It moved through another short arc, then stopped. Forward again. Another movement. The crowd had grown quiet. People who had been walking toward the next auction lot were now turning back. The scrapyard buyer lowered his card. The auctioneer came down from his wagon. "What does that mean?" Wade looked at Earl. Earl wiped his hands on his coat. "It means the engine isn't frozen solid." The auctioneer stared at him. "But the starter won't turn it." That's true. So what's wrong with it? Earl looked toward the starter. I didn't say I knew yet. Carl gave a short laugh. You just said the engine isn't stuck. I said it isn't frozen solid. That's the same thing. No. Earl pointed at the tractor. A seized engine won't suddenly give you movement because you rocked the machine backward. Carl frowned. Unless something inside shifted. Possible. Earl paused. But if something inside that engine were broken badly enough to lock the crank, I'd expect more than one clean click from the starter side. The auctioneer looked annoyed now. What are you saying? Earl did not want to say too much. Not while the bidding was still open. Not while the scrapyard buyer was standing 10 feet away. He had learned another lesson from his father that had nothing to do with machinery. Never explain value to the man you are bidding against. Earl stood and looked toward the auctioneer. You selling it or diagnosing it? A few men laughed. The auctioneer recovered quickly. Fair enough. He climbed back onto the wagon. Where were we? 900. Someone said. The scrapyard buyer raised his card again. 9. The auctioneer pointed toward Earl, looking for 1,000. Earl did not move. $1,000 was no longer scrap money. It was risk. He still had no guarantee the tractor would run. The starter might be bad. The ring gear could be damaged. There could be low compression, fuel problems, oil pressure problems, or something deep inside the engine that had not revealed itself yet. One click did not make a good tractor, but it had changed the odds. Before the test, everyone believed Lot 86 was a dead machine. Now Earl knew one thing they did not. Something had been holding the engine, and when they reversed the load, it let go. The auctioneer raised his hand. 900 once. Earl looked at the tractor. 900 twice. Then at the bright starter bolts. The auctioneer drew breath. Earl raised his hand. The auctioneer saw Earl's hand. 1,000. The scrapyard buyer turned around. For the first time that morning, he looked directly at Earl. Not at the tractor. At Earl. He was a broad man in a brown work vest. The kind of buyer who could estimate the value of iron almost by sight. To him, Lot 86 had been simple. Weight. Parts. Maybe a rear tire worth saving. Maybe a hydraulic pump. Maybe a set of wheel weights. Everything had a number. But now the old farmer had changed the calculation. The scrapyard buyer looked back at the tractor, then raised his card. 11. A murmur moved through the crowd. Carl Brenner leaned toward Earl. Walk away. Earl did not respond. 1,100 for something that still doesn't run. Carl continued. You already proved your point. The engine moves. Fine. That doesn't mean it's good. Earl knew that. Movement was not compression. Compression was not oil pressure. Oil pressure was not a healthy fuel system. And none of those things guaranteed the transmission. Hydraulics, clutch, or rear end were worth trusting. The tractor could still be a mistake. Just not the mistake everyone thought it was. The auctioneer pointed toward Earl. 12? Earl hesitated. He thought about the north field, the broken tractor under the tarp, the seed already stacked in the shed. He thought about Daniel telling him to hire the planting done. Then he looked at Lot 86 again. A tractor that had just given him one piece of evidence. Only one. He lowered his hand. Carl exhaled. Good. The auctioneer raised his voice. 1,100 once. The scrapyard buyer nodded slightly. 1,100 twice. Earl watched the man, then the tractor, then the starter. He had spent his whole life learning that risk was not the same thing as recklessness. Farmers gambled constantly. On seed, on weather forecasts that changed overnight, on machinery with 10,000 hours and one more season left in it, but the smart gamble was never blind. You looked for evidence. You asked what the crowd had missed. Then you decided how much that information was worth. The auctioneer lifted his hand for the final call. Earl raised 2 fingers. 1,200. Carl stared at him. You're insane. The scrapyard buyer glanced toward Earl one last time, then shook his head. He was done. The auctioneer smiled. 1,200 once. Earl felt no satisfaction. 1,200 twice. He was already calculating. If the starter drive was jammed, he could pull it. If the ring gear had a bad section, he might rotate the flywheel or replace it. If the engine had been sitting long enough for the fuel system to gum up, That was another problem. Every answer seemed to create two more questions. Sold. The auctioneer slapped his hand against the rail. $1,200 to number 43. The crowd immediately began moving toward the next lot. Just like that. The tractor stopped being entertainment. Now it belonged to Earl. Carl shook his head. You paid $1,200 for a machine nobody here could start. Earl folded his bidder card and slipped it into his coat pocket. No. Carl waited. Earl looked at the tractor. I paid $1,200 to find out why. That afternoon, Daniel arrived with the flatbed trailer. He climbed out of the truck. Salot 86. And stopped walking. You bought that? Earl nodded. Daniel circled the tractor slowly. The faded hood, the split seat, the soft tire, the oil stains. Then he read the auction tag still tied near the steering column. Engine locked up. Daniel looked at his father. How much? $1,200. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. Dad, it isn't locked. You started it? No. Then how do you know? Earl looked toward the starter housing. I don't. Daniel stared at him. Earl picked up a chain from the trailer. But I know everybody else stopped testing too early. They winched the tractor onto the flatbed as the auction continued behind them. No one applauded. No one cared. To everyone still bidding on equipment, Earl Mercer had just hauled away a piece of junk, and as the truck pulled onto the county road, even Earl knew there was only one way to prove otherwise. He would have to take it apart. By the time Earl and Daniel reached the farm, the sun was dropping behind the west tree line. They backed the trailer toward the machine shed and rolled Lot 86 down the ramps with a chain hooked to the pickup. The tractor landed on the dirt with a dull bounce. Up close, away from the noise of the auction, it looked even more tired. Dust coated the dashboard. Mouse droppings filled one corner beneath the seat. The fuel cap was rusted around the edge. A wasp nest hung beneath the left fender. Daniel stood with his hands on his hips. $1,200? Earl ignored him. He brought out a work light. An old creeper. A socket siat. And a shallow metal pan. Daniel watched him arrange everything beside the tractor. You planning to work on it tonight? I'm planning to answer one question. Which one? Earl pointed at the starter. Whether I just bought a tractor or a monument? Daniel almost smiled. Almost. Earl disconnected the battery first. Then he removed the cable from the starter terminal and tested the housing bolts. The same bolts he had noticed at the auction. The upper one came loose easily. The lower one fought him. He worked it slowly. Careful not to round the head. Daniel held the light. What exactly are you expecting to find? Don't know. That's not very reassuring. It shouldn't be. Earl removed the final bolt. Then he put both hands on the starter and pulled. It moved perhaps half an inch. Stopped. He pulled again. Nothing. Daniel frowned. Should it be that tight? No. Earl shifted his grip and rocked the housing gently. Back. Forward. Back again. Then the starter came free with a sudden jerk. A sharp metallic snap echoed through the shed. Daniel stepped closer. Earl lowered the starter onto the workbench. At the end of the shaft sat the drive gear. It should have been retracted. It was not. The small pinion was still extended outward, frozen near the position where it would engage the flywheel. One side of the teeth had been polished bright. Not polished from cleaning. Polished from friction. Daniel leaned over it. That bad? Earl turned the gear with his fingers. It moved reluctantly, then stuck. He tried to push it back along the shaft. It resisted. That's something. Daniel looked toward the tractor. Meaning? Meaning the starter drive wasn't coming back like it should. Daniel waited for more. Earl picked up the work light and aimed it into the starter opening. The flywheel ring gear was visible through the dark housing. Several teeth showed fresh, shiny marks. One had a small burr on its edge. Earl ran a fingertip over it. That sound at the auction? Daniel said. The clunk. Earl nodded. The starter gear was slamming into this. So the engine wasn't locked? Not proven yet. Daniel Sahil. You really enjoy making every answer difficult. Earl reached for a long breaker bar. No. Machines do that on their own. He moved to the front of the tractor. Near the crank pulley was a place where he could get a socket onto the crankshaft bolt. He fit the socket carefully. Then attached the breaker bar. Daniel's expression changed. If it doesn't move, then we keep looking. And if it does? Earl wrapped both hands around the bar. Then a lot of people at that auction were wrong. He applied pressure. Nothing. For a moment the bar felt solid in his hands. Daniel said nothing. Earl shifted his stance. Applied steady pressure again. The bar moved. Barely. Then farther. A slow, heavy turn. The fan rotated with it. Earl stopped. Daniel stared at the fan. Do that again? Earl reset the bar. Another pull. The crankshaft turned. Then resistance built. Not a dead stop. A firm, spring-like resistance. Earl held it there. Compression. Daniel stepped closer. Earl continued through the stroke. The resistance rose, then eased. The crank moved forward again. One full partial rotation. Then another. The old engine was not locked. It had never been locked. Earl let go of the bar. For the first time since the auction, he smiled. Only a little. Daniel looked from the crank pulley to the starter sitting on the bench. That little gear made everybody think the whole engine was ruined. It helped. Helped? Earl picked up the starter. Could be the drive sticking. Could be damaged teeth, holding it in engagement. Could be wear in the mechanism. We'll know more when we clean it. Daniel pointed at the engine. But the engine turns. Yes. So you were right. Earl looked at him. I was right about one thing. Daniel laughed. Of course. Earl set the starter down. He did not want the moment to become bigger than the evidence. A turning crankshaft did not mean the engine had good compression on every cylinder. It did not mean the bearings were healthy. It did not mean the oil pump worked. It did not mean the injection system was clean after years of sitting, but it changed the tractor completely. At the auction, Lot 86 had been valued as a dead engine attached to 4 tires. Now Earl knew the heart of the machine could still move. He cleaned the starter shaft with solvent and worked the drive gear back and forth. At first it stuck halfway. Then it began moving more freely. Daniel watched. You think that's all it was? No. You don't? Earl shook his head. Machines that sit this long usually collect problems. He inspected the gear again. The starter explains why it wouldn't turn over. He glanced toward the fuel tank. It doesn't explain why it was parked in the first place. That quieted Daniel. Earl rebuilt what he could that evening. He cleaned the drive, removed the burr, checked the starter on the bench. This time the gear moved outward and returned. Just like it was supposed to, they installed it after dark. Daniel climbed onto the tractor. Earl stood beside the engine bay. Don't keep cranking if it sounds wrong. Daniel turned the key. The dash lights glowed. He pressed the starter. For the first time in years, the engine turned. Not one clunk. Not half a revolution. It rolled through compression again and again. Raw, raw. Daniel looked down at Earl. Earl listened carefully. The engine was turning. The auctioneer had been wrong. The dealer had been wrong. The scrap buyer had walked away from a tractor with a free crankshaft. Daniel shouted over the starter. It's turning. Earl nodded, then raised one hand. Stop. Daniel released the switch. The shed went silent. He looked confused. What? Earl had been listening for something else. Something that had not happened. No cough. No smoke. Not even the faintest attempt to fire. Daniel looked at the exhaust stack, then back at his father. So now what? Earl stared at the old tractor. They had solved the problem everyone could hear. Now they had to find the problem. Nobody could. For a few seconds, neither man moved. The starter had turned the engine exactly the way Earl hoped it would. Strong enough to roll through compression, smooth enough that nothing inside sounded broken. And still the tractor had not made the slightest attempt to start. Daniel climbed down from the seat. So we fixed the wrong problem. Earl looked at him. No. It still doesn't run. That doesn't make the first problem imaginary. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face. Dad, I understand that. I'm saying we're still standing beside a $1,200 tractor that doesn't run. Earl looked back at the machine. Daniel was right about that part. At the auction, Earl had been focused on one question. Was the engine actually seized? Now he had his answer. No. But that answer had created a more difficult question. Why had the tractor been parked before anyone decided the engine was locked? Earl climbed onto the platform. He turned the key again. The starter engaged cleanly. Rrr. He watched the exhaust stack. Nothing. No gray haze. No black smoke. No brief puff of unburned fuel. He stopped immediately. Daniel stood beside the hood. What does no smoke mean? It means I'm not convinced fuel is reaching the cylinders. That good? Better than some possibilities. Which possibilities? Low compression, injection problems, internal timing. Take your pick. Daniel stared at him. You say things like that like they're comforting. Earl climbed down. They're not. He opened the fuel cap. The smell was old and sour. The tank was not empty. Earl shined a flashlight inside. There was fuel at the bottom. Dark enough that he didn't trust it. He moved down to the sediment bowl. A layer of debris rested in the glass. Rust. Fine dirt. Something that looked almost like varnish clung to the bottom. Daniel leaned closer. That's supposed to be in there? No. Earl opened the fuel shutoff. The liquid in the bowl barely changed. A weak thread of fuel moved downward, then almost stopped. Earl watched it. Daniel noticed his expression. You found it? I found something. That means yes? It means something is restricting the fuel. Earl tapped the bowl lightly with the handle of a screwdriver. A few dark flakes broke loose. The fuel moved for a moment, then slowed again. Daniel let out a breath. So clean that, and we're done. Earl shook his head. Maybe. Daniel laughed without humor. There's that word again. Earl closed the shutoff. He had spent too many years repairing equipment to confuse the first visible problem with the only problem. A dirty sediment bowl could explain poor fuel flow. So could a blocked line, a plugged tank outlet, a clogged filter, air in the system, a failed injection pump. A tractor that had been abandoned for years could carry several failures at once, each hiding behind the next. The starter had been one layer, now they were looking at another. Daniel leaned against the fender. You still think it was worth buying? Earl looked at the tractor. The answer came slower this time. I think the engine is better than they said. That's not what I asked. No. Earl looked toward the north field beyond the shed. In darkness, the ground was invisible, but he knew exactly where it was, exactly how little time remained before he needed a working tractor. He looked back at Daniel. I'll tell you whether it was worth buying when it pulls something. Then Earl held the flashlight closer to the sediment bowl. A tiny bubble appeared in the fuel line, then another. He frowned. Daniel saw it. What? Earl reached up slowly and loosened the fuel cap. A faint hiss escaped. The fuel in the bowl suddenly began moving faster. Earl stopped. Daniel looked from the tank to his father. What just happened? Earl tightened the cap again. The flow weakened. He loosened it. The flow returned. Earl stared at the old cap. For the first time that night, the second problem had finally started talking. Earl removed the fuel cap completely. The weak stream in the sediment bowl became steady. Not strong, but steady. Daniel stared at it. That cap is doing that? Looks like it. He took the cap to the workbench and turned it over beneath the light. From the outside, it looked ordinary. Rust around the rim, a faded rubber seal, a dent where somebody had probably dropped it years earlier. Earl used a thin piece of wire to probe the tiny vent passage. It would not go through. He tried from the other side. Nothing. Daniel leaned against the bench. Why would a fuel cap need a vent? Earl tapped the tank with one finger. Fuel leaves. Air has to replace it. And if it doesn't, tank pulls a vacuum. Daniel looked toward the tractor. So the engine starves. Eventually. Earl set the cap down. It was a small problem, almost laughably small, compared with the verdict written on the auction tag. Engine locked up. First, a starter drive had made a turning engine appear, seized. Now a blocked vent could make a fuel system appear dead. 2 failures. Neither one, inside the engine. Earl was beginning to understand how Lot 86 had acquired its reputation. Someone had probably tried to start it. It had cranked poorly, maybe run briefly, maybe died. Then one problem had been mistaken for another. Years passed. The story got shorter. The tractor became the one with the bad engine. By auction day, nobody remembered the steps between working and worthless. They only remembered the verdict. Daniel picked up the fuel cap. So we clean this and try again? Not yet. Why? Because that fuel has been sitting too long. Earl pointed at the sediment bowl, and because whatever is in that glass is also in the rest of the system, he drained the old fuel into a metal container. At first it came out dark, then darker. Fine rust settled at the bottom. Small flakes moved through the stream. Daniel made a face. That was supposed to burn? Not in anything I own. They removed the sediment bowl. Earl cleaned it carefully and checked the screen above it. The mesh was partially covered with varnish-like residue and rust particles. He held it beneath the light. There's your second restriction. Daniel smiled. Second, cap was 1. Earl pointed to the screen. This is 2. You think there's a 3? Earl looked toward the fuel line. There's always a 3. Daniel laughed. This time Earl did too. They removed the line and blew it clear. More debris came out than Daniel expected. Then Earl checked the filter. It was old enough that he replaced it rather than pretending cleaning would make it trustworthy. By midnight, the system from tank to filter was clean enough for a controlled test. Daniel brought fresh diesel from a can in the pickup. Earl stopped him before he poured. Slow. Daniel lowered the can. You think the tank leaks? I think we haven't earned confidence yet. They added only a few gallons. Earl opened the shutoff. Fuel entered the bowl cleanly. No hesitation. No bubbles. The difference was immediate. Daniel nodded toward the tractor. No? Almost. Earl loosened the bleed point at the filter. Air escaped first. Then fuel. He closed it. Moved farther down the system. One step at a time. Daniel watched him. You knew all this at the auction? Earl shook his head. I knew enough not to believe the first diagnosis. That's different. It's supposed to be. He wiped his hands. Knowing what's wrong and knowing what hasn't been proven are two different things. Daniel looked at the tractor again. For the first time, the machine seemed less like a bad purchase and more like a puzzle being stripped of its disguises. Starter, fuel cup, dirty bowl, blocked screen, old filter. Each problem was small enough to be ignored. Together, they had turned a usable machine into a legend about a dead engine. Earl climbed onto the seat. Daniel stood beside the hood. Ready? No. Daniel frowned. You just spent 2 hours fixing the fuel system. I spent 2 hours fixing what I could see. He turned the key to the on position. The gauges woke. Earl waited several seconds, then pressed the starter. War! The engine turned strongly. This time, a faint gray puff rose from the exhaust. Daniel pointed. There. Earl released the starter. Silence returned. But Earl had seen it. Fuel had reached at least part of the combustion process. He tried again. Another puff. Then, cough. The engine kicked once. Daniel slapped the fender. It fired. Once. Once is more than 0. Earl could not argue with that. He waited 30 seconds before trying again. The starter rolled. The engine coughed twice. Almost caught. Then fell back into cranking. Earl stopped. Daniel looked confused. Why stop? It's close. Close is when people break things. Earl climbed down. He checked for leaks. None. Touched the fuel lines. Looked at the exhaust. Smelled the air. Fresh diesel. Not much, but enough to prove the system was doing something it had not done before. Daniel looked toward the starter. So the first problem kept the engine from turning. Yes. The second kept it from getting fuel. Partly. And now? Earl stared at lot 86. Now we find out what sitting for years did to everything in between. Daniel shook his head. This tractor has layers. Earl looked at the auction tag still hanging from the steering column. Engine locked up. He undid it, folded it once, then placed it on the workbench. Most bad diagnoses do. Outside the machine shed, the night had gone completely still. Inside, the old tractor had gone from silence to movement, from movement to smoke, from smoke to one brief cough. It had not started yet, but for the first time since Earl brought it home, it was no longer acting dead. It was trying. Earl did not try to start the tractor again that night. Daniel wanted to. The engine had coughed twice. Smoke had finally appeared. To him, that meant they were one more turn of the key away from victory. To Earl, it meant the opposite. They were finally close enough to damage something if they became careless. He shut off the lights in the machine shed a little after midnight. Tomorrow, he said. Daniel looked disappointed. You've waited 5 years to hear that engine run? I've waited 6 hours. That's not what I meant. I know. Earl looked back at the tractor before closing the door. If it's good, it'll still be good in the morning. At sunrise, he was already back in the shed. Before touching the starter, Earl checked the engine oil. The level was acceptable. The oil was dark, but not milky. No obvious water. No metal glittering on the dipstick. He removed the old oil filter and replaced it. Then he checked the cooling system. Daniel arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee. You're changing parts before we even know it runs? I'm changing cheap things before I ask expensive things to work. Daniel handed him a cup. Earl checked the coolant. Low. Not empty. He inspected the hoses, the radiator, and the water pump for obvious leaks. Nothing severe. Then he turned his attention back to the fuel system. Fresh diesel in the tank. Clean sediment bowl. Clear flow. New filter. Air bled from the lines. Everything they had corrected the night before still held. Daniel climbed onto the tractor. Now? Earl walked around the machine once more. Not yet. Daniel looked toward the ceiling. Earl ignored him. He loosened the line at the first injector. Crank it. Daniel pressed the starter. The engine rolled over. Fuel pulsed at the fitting. Earl tightened it. He repeated the process farther down the engine. 1 cylinder. Then another. Fuel. 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 Not proof of perfect injection, but proof that the system was delivering. Earl stepped back. All right. Daniel sat straighter. That sounded different. It was the same word. Not from you. Earl moved beside the engine bay where he could see everything. Short crank. Daniel turned the key. Rrr. Gray smoke lifted from the exhaust. The engine coughed once. Then twice. Daniel kept his hand on the switch. Earl slapped the side of the hood. Stop. Daniel released it. What? Give the starter a rest? They waited. Earl listened to the silence. No fuel dripping. No coolant running. No unusual smell beyond old oil and fresh diesel. He touched the starter housing. Warm. Not dangerously hot. One more. Daniel pressed the switch. The starter engaged. Rah. Cough. Cough. The engine stumbled forward. For half a second, the starter was no longer doing all the work. Then the engine died. Daniel laughed. That was it. Almost. It ran. It participated. Daniel shook his head. You are impossible. Earl gave the starter another minute. Then he opened the throttle slightly. Not much. Enough to give the engine room to catch. Again. Daniel turned the key. The starter rolled. Gray smoke rose. The engine coughed harder. Then, boom. A deeper sound came from the exhaust. The engine caught 1 cylinder. Lost it. Caught again. Whirr. Boom. It. Boom boom. Then the entire tractor shook. Daniel's hand moved toward the key. Leave it. The engine stumbled into life. Not smoothly. Not proudly. It ran like a machine waking after a bad dream. Uneven firing. A hard metallic diesel CLUNK. Gray smoke pushing from the stack in irregular bursts. Earl leaned toward the engine. Listening. Daniel shouted over the noise. Should I shut it down? Not yet. Earl watched the oil pressure gauge. The needle rose. Slowly. Then held. That mattered more than the noise. He checked the engine bay. No oil pouring out. No coolant spraying. No belt trying to leave the pulley. The exhaust began to clear. 1 cylinder that had been missing started firing more consistently. The idle changed. From chaos to rhythm. Clatter. 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 Daniel stared at his father. Earl was not smiling. He was listening. To the timing. To the bearings. To the fan. To the exhaust. To every sound that should not have been there. The tractor had spent years being described by one sound. CLUNK. That single noise had convinced people the engine was dead. Now the engine was making dozens of sounds at once. And to Earl, none of them sounded like death. Daniel climbed down carefully. It's running. Earl nodded. You were right. About the starter. And the engine. Earl looked toward the old auction tag on the workbench. Engine locked up. No. Daniel frowned. It's running in front of you. I was right that they hadn't proven it was bad. That seems like the same thing. It isn't. Earl adjusted the throttle slightly. The engine responded. Not perfectly, but immediately, a little more smoke rose. Then cleared. He watched the temperature gauge begin moving off cold. The old tractor continued idling. Daniel laughed and slapped the fender. $1,200. Earl finally smiled. Don't spend the profit yet. What profit? We still haven't moved it. Daniel looked down at the gear shift. Oh. Earl's smile disappeared. An engine could run beautifully while the rest of the tractor failed around it. A bad clutch. A broken transmission. Weak hydraulics. A rear end full of damaged gears. They had proven that the auctioneer's diagnosis was wrong. They had not yet proven that Earl had bought a working tractor. He climbed into the seat. Pressed the clutch. The pedal felt stiff. He moved the gear lever toward first. It resisted. He tried again. The lever slipped into position. Daniel stepped away from the rear tire. Earl eased his foot off the clutch. For one long second, nothing happened. Then the tractor moved. 6 inches. A foot. 2 feet. The old rear tires rolled across the dirt floor of the shed. Earl pressed the clutch again. Stopped. Daniel laughed louder than the engine. Earl shifted into reverse. The tractor backed toward the doorway. Morning sunlight crossed the hood for the first time since they had brought it home. The exhaust beat steadily above Earl's head. He drove it into the yard. One slow circle. Then another. No applause. No auction crowd. No dealer watching. Just Daniel standing beside the barn with both hands on his hips. Earl brought the tractor to an idle. Daniel shouted, "So what did you buy?" Earl looked toward the north field. Not at the tractor. At the work waiting beyond it. Then he answered, "Something that still has to prove itself." Because starting was not the test Earl cared about. A tractor was not valuable because it could make noise in a yard. It was valuable because of what it could pull when the ground pushed back. 3 weeks later, Earl drove Lot 86 into town. By then, it was no longer the same tractor he had hauled home from the auction. It looked almost the same. The paint was still faded. The seat was still split. Rust still ran beneath the exhaust manifold. But Earl had replaced the leaking hydraulic hose, repaired the worst rear tire, checked the brakes, and tightened enough steering play that he trusted the machine on the county road. More importantly, the tractor had already worked. It had pulled a light disc across the north field, then a drag. The hydraulics were slower than Earl liked. But they lifted. The transmission pulled. The engine held temperature. Oil pressure stayed steady. That morning, Earl needed filters and a new drawbar pin. He could have taken the pickup. Instead, he took the tractor. A machine that was going to work on his farm needed to prove it could travel farther than the barnyard. He kept the speed modest. Listened to the transmission. Watched the gauges. Nothing gave him a reason to turn around. When he reached Brenner Equipment, Earl parked near the parts entrance and shut the engine down. The old diesel ticked softly as it cooled. Carl Brenner came through the door carrying a box. He stopped, looked at Earl, then at the tractor. No. Earl climbed down. Carl walked around the front. That's Lot 86. Same one. You rebuild the engine? No. Replace it? No. Carl stared at the faded hood. Then what was wrong? Earl leaned against the fender. Starter drive was hanging against the flywheel. Carl's expression changed. That was the CLUNK? That was part of it. Part? Fuel system was dirty. Tank vent was plugged. Filter was bad. Years of sitting added its own problems. Carl shook his head. So, everybody called the engine seized over a starter? Not exactly. Earl looked at him. They heard a symptom and stopped looking. Before Carl could answer, the store door opened again. The auctioneer stepped outside carrying a cup of coffee. He took 2 steps. Stopped. Then slowly lowered the cup. You've got to be kidding me. Carl smiled. Recognize it? The auctioneer walked toward the tractor. That's the locked up one. Earl said nothing. The auctioneer studied the engine. You put another motor in it? No. Rebuilt this one? No. Then how did you know? Earl looked at him. I didn't. The auctioneer frowned. You told us it wasn't seized. I said nobody had proved it was. For a moment, nobody spoke. Earl pointed toward the starter. When we rocked the tractor backward, the crank moved and something released near the starter. He tapped the housing. That was evidence. Carl folded his arms. And the fuel problems? Found those afterward. The auctioneer looked uncomfortable. So you got lucky. Some? Earl did not argue. Old machinery always carried risk. A cracked block could have ended the story. A bad transmission could still have made $1,200 a mistake. But luck had not noticed the wrench marks. Luck had not watched the fan move. Luck had not tested the tractor in both directions. Earl picked up his parts list. I just kept asking what the last test actually proved. Carl smiled slightly. The auctioneer looked at the tractor again. How much is it worth now? Earl glanced toward the road home. Then toward the fields beyond town. That depends. On what? Whether you want something pretty? Earl climbed back onto the seat. Or something that works. He turned the key. The starter spun cleanly. The diesel caught almost immediately. The auctioneer said nothing. Carl only grinned. Earl eased the tractor into gear and pulled onto the road. 3 weeks earlier, those men had watched Lot 86, refused to turn and called it junk. Now they watched the same faded tractor drive away under its own power. Earl never looked back. The machine was not finished proving itself. The North Field would take care of that. The real test came 2 days after Earl returned from town. Rain was forecast for Thursday night. Not a storm, just enough to matter. The North Field had already been worked once, but the lower end was still heavy from spring moisture, and Earl needed to finish planting before the ground turned sticky again. He was in the machine shed before sunrise. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later. You're taking that one? Earl was already checking the oil. That one has fuel in it. Daniel looked toward the newer tractor still sitting beneath the blue tarp. Then back at Lot 86. You trust it now? Earl pulled the dipstick. Wiped it. Checked again. No. Daniel laughed. Then why use it? Because trust isn't the same thing as proof. He closed the hood. Today it gets proof. They hooked the planter behind the tractor. The hitch pin dropped into place. Hydraulic lines connected. Seed boxes filled. Nothing dramatic. No crowd. No auctioneer. No men standing around waiting for Earl to fail. That made the morning feel more serious. Machines could impress people in a yard. Fields did not care. Earl climbed into the seat and started the engine. The diesel caught after 2 turns. A faint gray haze rose from the exhaust and disappeared. He let the tractor warm while Daniel checked the planter. Then they headed toward the North Field. The first pass was easy. Ground near the gate was dry and firm. The tractor pulled steadily. Engine temperature, normal. Oil pressure, steady. Earl watched the gauges almost as much as he watched the row marker. At the end of the field, he turned. Second pass. Third. Fourth. Nothing unusual. Then they reached the lower ground. Earl knew that section well. Dark soil. More moisture. More drag. The kind of ground that told the truth about machinery. The planter sank slightly deeper. The engine note changed. Just enough for Earl to hear it. Daniel, riding the edge of the field in the pickup, slowed and watched. The tractor began pulling harder. The exhaust darkened. Earl gave it a little more throttle. The rear tires bit into the soil. For a moment, the engine sounded strained. Not sick. Working. Earl felt the difference through the seat. This was the test. Not whether it could idle. Not whether it could drive into town. Whether it could carry a load when the ground resisted. The tractor kept moving. Slowly. Steadily. Row after row. By noon, Earl stopped beside the fence to check everything. Daniel walked over. How's it doing? Earl touched the rear hub. Warm. Normal. Then the hydraulic fittings. Dry. He checked the oil again. No change. Coolant level stable. Daniel smiled. So? Earl looked across the field. Half the North 40 was planted. You tell me? Daniel followed his gaze. For the first time since the auction, he had no argument. They ate sandwiches beside the pickup. The old tractor sat 30 feet away. Paint faded. Seat torn. Dirt covering the tires. It still looked almost exactly like the machine everyone had rejected. That was the strange part. Nothing about its appearance had changed enough to explain its new value. The engine had not been rebuilt. The hood had not been repainted. The tractor had not been restored into something beautiful. Earl had only corrected the things that prevented it from doing what it was built to do. After lunch, they went back to work. Late that afternoon, clouds gathered in the west. Earl had 6 passes left. Then 4. Then 2. The tractor kept pulling. When the final row reached the fence line, Earl lifted the planter and turned toward the gate. He stopped at the top of the hill. Below him, the field stretched out in long, dark rows, seed in the ground, before the rain, exactly where it needed to be. Daniel parked beside him and stepped out. "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "That auction tag." Earl looked over. "Engine locked up." Those 3 words had nearly decided the tractor's entire future. Scrapyard. Parts machine. Dead iron. Not because anyone had proven the tractor worthless, because somebody had stopped looking. Earl turned his eyes back toward the field. The tractor had now pulled a disc, pulled a drag, pulled a planter, carried itself to town and back. The argument was finished. A running engine had been evidence. A planted field was proof. Daniel rested one arm on the fender. "You could probably sell it now for a lot more than $1,200. Earl looked at him. "Why would I?" "Because you proved everybody wrong." Earl shook his head. "That wasn't why I bought it." He pointed toward the rows below them. That was... The first drops of rain began to hit the hood. Small, cold, scattered. Earl started the tractor again. The engine settled into its familiar rhythm. They drove back toward the barn as the rain thickened behind them. By the time the north field disappeared beneath the gray curtain, the seed was already in the ground, and the tractor everyone had called junk had done the one thing no argument could do. It had earned its place. A week after planting, Daniel found the auction tag on Earl's workbench. It was still folded in half. Engine locked up. Daniel picked it up. "You kept this?" Earl was sharpening a mower blade. "Forgot to throw it away." Daniel smiled. "No, you didn't." Earl kept working. The grinder sent a short stream of sparks across the bench. Daniel unfolded the tag. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "Everybody thinks you knew exactly what was wrong with that tractor the second you saw it." Earl stopped the grinder. For the first time, the shop went quiet. "That's not what happened." Daniel held up the tag. "You told them the engine wasn't stuck." "I told them I didn't believe they had proved it was stuck." "That's a very farmer way to avoid saying you were right." Earl set the blade down. "No, it matters." Daniel waited. Earl pointed toward the tractor parked outside the open shed door. "If I had decided at the auction that the starter was definitely the problem, I would have been doing the same thing they were doing." "What do you mean? Guessing too early?" He wiped the metal dust from his hands. "The difference wasn't that I knew more than every man standing there." Earl looked at the tag. "The difference was that I wasn't willing to stop at the first explanation." Daniel leaned against the workbench. Earl continued. "The starter made a clunk." He held up one finger. "That was a symptom. The engine wouldn't turn." A second finger. Another symptom. The tractor had been sitting for years. A third. That was history. Daniel nodded. "And everybody turned all of that into one answer. Seized engine." "Right." Earl folded his arms. "But none of those things proved a seized engine." Daniel glanced outside. "So you rocked it?" "I tried to separate one system from another." The phrase sounded more technical than Earl intended. He walked toward the tractor. "When you push a machine in gear, you're asking the wheels to turn the engine, instead of asking the starter to do it." Daniel followed. "And when it moved backward, we learned the crankshaft could move. And the click? That told me something near the starter had changed when the load reversed." They reached the tractor. Earl rested one hand on the faded hood. That was evidence. He tapped the hood once. Not a miracle. Daniel looked back toward the workbench. And then the fuel problem. Same mistake waiting to happen. The engine cranked but would not fire. They could have called the injection pump bad. Could have blamed low compression. Could have ordered parts before understanding the failure. Instead, Earl had watched. No smoke. Weak fuel flow. Bubbles. Then, one detail that changed when the fuel cap was loosened. Each clue narrowed the possibilities. None of them deserved to become a verdict until the next test supported it. Daniel looked at his father. Where'd you learn to think like that? Earl almost answered with his father's name. Instead, he looked toward the north field. Bad decisions. Daniel laughed. Earl did not. Seriously. He ran his thumb across a scratch in the tractor's paint. You make enough mistakes long enough? You either learn to slow down or you keep paying for the same lesson. He had done it with machinery. Replaced a carburetor when the problem was a cracked fuel line. Blamed seed when the planter depth was wrong. Added fertilizer where the real problem was drainage. Once, years ago, he had nearly sold a cow because she stopped gaining weight. The problem had been a bad tooth. Different situations. Same failure. Seeing the result and pretending the cause was obvious, Daniel looked again at the words on the tag. Engine locked up. It's strange how confident those words sound. That's why people trust them. Earl took the tag from him. A confident answer feels better than an unfinished question. He folded it along the old crease. But machines don't care how confident you are. Neither did soil. Neither did weather. Neither did animals. A field yellowing in June could mean poor nitrogen, or wet roots, or damaged roots, or disease, or compaction. One visible problem could have 5 invisible causes. Experience did not mean Earl always knew which one was right. Experience meant he had been wrong enough times to respect the difference. Daniel sat on the tractor's rear tire. So when the auctioneer called it junk, he wasn't wrong that it had problems. But he was wrong about what the problems meant. Earl nodded. That's closer. The tractor did not become valuable because Earl believed in it. Belief had nothing to do with it. The starter had either released or it had not. The crankshaft either turned or it did not. Fuel either flowed or it did not. Oil pressure either held or it did not. And when the tractor pulled the planter through wet ground, it gave the final answer. Daniel looked toward the north field. Green shoots had already begun appearing in faint lines across the soil. You think people do the same thing with farms? All the time. With what? Bad ground. Old equipment. Old buildings. Earl paused. Old farmers? Daniel looked at him. Earl smiled slightly. People see something that doesn't perform the way they expect, and they rush to decide what it's worth. He slid the auction tag into the tractor's toolbox. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Thought you forgot to throw that away. Earl closed the lid. I changed my mind. Why keep it? Earl looked at the rows of young plants beyond the barn. Reminder. Of what? He gave the toolbox one final tap. That a symptom tells you where to start looking. Then Earl walked back toward the shop. It doesn't tell you where to stop. By midsummer, the north field no longer looked like a problem waiting to happen. The rows Earl had planted that spring were green now, straight enough from the road, uneven in places if you knew where to look. The lower ground still held more moisture. The west edge still ran lighter where the soil thinned. Nothing about the field had become perfect. Neither had the tractor. Lot 86 still wore the same faded paint. The seat was still torn. The hood still carried scratches from owners. Earl would never know. One rear tire continued to lose a little air if it sat too long, and on cold mornings, the steering reminded him that 70-year-old machinery had opinions of its own. Earl never restored it. He never painted over the rust, never polished the wheels, never tried to make it look valuable. He replaced what failed, maintained what worked, and used it. That summer it pulled a hay wagon, ran the auger, moved a gravity box, dragged an old section of fence away from the creek. Small jobs mostly, the kind nobody takes pictures of, the kind that are the difference between a farm operating and a farm slowly falling apart. One evening, Daniel found Earl standing at the shed door. The tractor was parked inside. Sunlight came through the boards behind it, cutting long orange lines across the concrete floor. Daniel stopped beside him. You know, he said, if you clean that thing up, you could probably sell it for decent money now. Earl looked at the tractor. Probably. You ever think about it? No. Daniel smiled. Not even once? Earl shook his head. The engine ticked softly as it cooled from the day's work. Daniel looked toward the field. Funny. What is? Everybody at that auction looked at the same tractor you did. Earl nodded. They heard the same clunk. Yes. They saw it wouldn't turn over. Yes. Daniel glanced at his father. So what did you see that they didn't? Earl thought about the question. For weeks, people had told the story as if he had possessed some special knowledge. The moment he walked up to the tractor, as if experience meant knowing the answer before everyone else, that was not what Earl remembered. He remembered uncertainty. He remembered one polished mark, a fan that moved slightly, a starter that sounded wrong, a question nobody had finished asking. "I saw the same thing they did," he finally said. Daniel frowned. Then what was different? Earl looked across the yard. Beyond the fence, the north field moved in the evening wind. The plants were high enough now that the rows were becoming harder to see. The meaning? Daniel waited. Earl continued. They saw a machine that wouldn't start and decided what it was worth. He looked back at the tractor. "I saw a machine that wouldn't start and wanted to know why." Daniel nodded slowly. That was all, Earl said. There was nothing left to prove. The auctioneer had seen the tractor running. Carl had heard the engine himself. Daniel had watched it pull the planter through the heaviest part of the field. The evidence had already done the arguing. Later that evening, Earl climbed onto the tractor one more time. He needed to move an empty wagon from the field before dark. He turned the key. The starter engaged cleanly. The old diesel fired and settled into its familiar rhythm. No violent clunk. No silence. Just the steady mechanical beat of a machine doing what it had been built to do. Earl eased it into gear. The tractor rolled out of the shed and toward the field. For a moment, the setting sun caught the faded hood. It did not make the tractor look new. It made every scratch visible, every year, every mistake, every repair. And somehow that suited Earl better, because the tractor had never needed to become new. It had only needed someone to understand what was actually wrong. At the auction, men had called it dead iron, a parts machine, junk. They were not wrong about what they saw. They were wrong about what it meant. The tractor disappeared slowly between the rows. And Earl Mercer carried one lesson with him that was older than any machine on the farm. A symptom can tell you where to begin, but only patience tells you where the truth is. And sometimes the difference between junk and something worth saving is one more question.